Now let's head to Southeast Asia and take a look at how economies there are coping with the effects of the European crisis.
Getting to grips with inflation was supposed to be Southeast Asian governments' top priority this year. But now their focus has shifted to coping with the effects of Europe's financial turmoil. In October, Bank Indonesia cut its key interest rate from 6.75% to 6.5%. It was the first rate cut in more than 2 years. The bank trimmed the rate by another half percentage point last month. The Bank of Thailand also reduced its key rate from 3.5% to 3.25% in November. It was the first rate cut in more than 2 years. Countries in the region are preparing for an economic slowdown as shrinking European demand dents their exports. Almost 11% of the exports of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations' 10 member countries go to the EU, making it ASEAN's number 3 export destination. Such concerns led the Asian Development Bank to lower its 2012 growth forecast for East Asia from 7.5% to 7.2% last Tuesday. The ADB cautioned that growth could be as low as 5.4% if the EU crisis escalates and the United States and Europe slide back into recession. Capital outflow is another big concern for Asian economies. Capital flowed into the region earlier this year due to monetary easing in the U.S. But Asian stock and bond markets are now seeing portfolio outflows as nervous investors move their funds to safe havens such as the yen and gold. That's likely to have a negative impact on investment in the region and could cause a credit crunch. There are fears that could put additional downward pressure on growth in the region in the coming months.
For more on the region's economic outlook, I recently sat down with Iwan Aziz, head of the ADB's Office of Regional Economic Integration. I started by asking him how a global economic slowdown would affect Southeast Asia.
If we look at the ASEAN export, despite the fact that the intra-ASEAN trade has been increasing in the last couple of years, the components of the export to traditional markets, including Europe and the US, are still the largest. So you can imagine if Europe and US economy is going to be continuing slowing in terms of its growth, the demand for export from ASEAN will also be affected. So that is one aspect. The other aspect is on the trade financing. Even though trade financing is financial issues, but eventually it affects the export activities. Because if I'm going to export, I need some trade financing. And now that trade financing is getting more and more limited. So the worst scenario is that if the situation in Europe is not improving, then trade financing sources will dry up, and that translates into trouble for export from ASEAN.
Let's say the worst happens in Europe, the euro system collapses. How big of an impact would that have on Southeast Asia?
We can see two different scenarios. One is that if the impact is so severe on ASEAN, it may provide impetus for the authorities in ASEAN to find the alternative, for example, in the case of trade, the alternative destination of their export. And the good news is it is happening already since 2008, since the Lehman collapse. Because as I said earlier, as far as the final good export is concerned from ASEAN, are mostly going to Europe and the US. And in 2008, US economy was in trouble because of the Lehman collapse. And from then until now, we see the patterns of trade from ASEAN is moving within ASEAN themselves, as well as to other emerging markets, not to the US. In fact, the share of the ASEAN export to US has been declining, whereas the share of ASEAN export to other emerging markets, as well as within ASEAN, has been increasing. Now, what I'm saying here is that if that worst scenario, like what you mentioned, happen, I think there will be a strong impetus for the ASEAN to even intensify the change in the trade direction.
Let's now take a look at what regional integration means for Southeast Asia and what progress has been made over the years.
ASEAN member countries have a combined population of some 600 million people, compared with just over 500 million in the EU. Thanks to increased trade with China, as well as among ASEAN members, the combined GDP of the association's 10 nations tripled between 2000 and 2010 to $1.8 trillion. Amid growing concern in the region about the possible impact of the US-led Trans-Pacific Partnership, ASEAN is also trying to create its own free trade zone. At a summit held in Bali in November, the association announced it hopes to create a free trade zone that includes Japan, China, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. It also aims to forge stronger political and economic links between its members through a proposed ASEAN community by 2015.
I recently talked to ASEAN Secretary General Dr. Surin Pitsuwan and started by asking him what kind of economic partnership he envisions for the region.
What ASEAN would like to do now is to promote our own architecture, we call, and it is called the ASEAN Framework on Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It can be open for any new partners wanting to come in. There is no date specifically identified, particularly, external markets traditional to us is no longer dependable, or it will take a long time for them to recover and be our robust markets again. It's better for us to try to integrate and create our own economic community here.
How does an ASEAN-centered economic regional framework relate to the U.S.-led Trans-Pacific Partnership?
We don't think it's a competition. We think, if anything, it's going to be complementary and drawing upon synergies of each and driving forward toward a wider economic integration in the future.
But there's been concern that because ASEAN members are currently in talks to form the TPP, that could erode ASEAN's centrality when it comes to forming an economic regional framework.
ASEAN has been rather effective in trying to accommodate everyone and trying to synergize among them and between them and move the process forward. So I don't personally have any fear that we might be losing our centrality or our leadership.
ASEAN has set the target of becoming an ASEAN economic community by 2015. How is that process coming along, and what lessons has ASEAN learned from Europe's experience?
We are different in so many ways as opposed to Europe. So we have to be extremely careful. Europe now, they are talking about the fact that you can't have a monetary union unless you also have a full budgetary union, which is a big challenge. I don't think ASEAN is moving in that direction soon.
Dr. Surin, thank you very much for your insights.